institutions that organize this, and I would like to thank very much all the people who helped me enormously in organizing the summer school. The co-director of the school, Jose Martin, thank you very much, and Andrew Williams, who is not officially one of the co-directors, but was of enormous help in thinking about the idea and the way of organizing, and he helped me very much in several ways. And thank you very much for this. Thank you very much also to the people who come, to our leading participants, to Professor ThomasChristiano. It's an enormous pleasure, an honor, and a privilege to have you last year. Thank you very much. And to Andrew, who also participated in the organization, but is also one of the leading participants. So to the symposium of Professor Christiano and Professor Andrew Williams. And the third one is Professor David Miller, who will join us on Wednesday. And thanks to all other participants who will speak, to the institutions to support us. And I hope I didn't forget anything. If I did, please excuse me, but there is some pressure I feel in this organization, and I have such a developed habit in doing such things. So I would like the authorities to express, invite the authorities to express their greetings. First, the Dean of our faculty, colleague and professor and friend, Frederick Schuster, who is also a member of the Department of Philosophy. So, please.
Thank you, you're also probably in the back. The organizers. So you really didn't miss anyone. So thank you for a brief introduction. I would like to express my warm welcome on behalf of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, especially to PhD students and postdocs. You are the participants of this first edition of summer school, and my special warm welcome go to you. So please enjoy your stay at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences on the University campus, Rijeka. Also, I would like to express many thanks to our dear partners from Barcelona and Leeds. It's very important that we are getting more and more international. This is crucial for our young, and I would say the second generation. But also it's very important for county and city plans, especially applying for European cultural capital in the next upcoming years. So this international aspect of our collaboration is crucial. So we next to the organizers, especially Center for Advanced Studies and the Department of Philosophy, in recognizing this international aspect of research and education. Finally, special thanks go to our department, Professor Baccarini, but also Center for Advanced Studies. And here I'm highlighting the bottom line on behalf of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and that's that we need, especially for the first time outside Zagreb program. I would highlight this Master of Arts program in Political Science and International Studies, and this is crucial point for Croatian educational research system to extend the political science area and international studies area outside Zagreb. And I'm seeing Rijeka and Center for Advanced Studies and also efforts coming from the Department of Philosophy as a platform, as the best platform to finally have a Master of Arts degree in Political Science and International Studies in the upcoming years here in Rijeka. And that's why in the summer school program is so important for our institution. Finally, good luck with your research. Dear colleagues, dear friends, especially postdocs and pre-docs, doctoral students. This is the most sensible time spending in your career. So good luck with that, and stay here, be here, and head of the department, Professor Baccarini, will explain you how to be in touch with us. One of the possible ties with our department is senior colloquia, senior seminars. This is very important, and I'm looking forward the best of you will come here and deliver your talk in the upcoming years. Good luck and see you around in this week of the first edition That's it.
Who is our Vice Chancellor and Director of the Center for Advanced Studies, and a philosopher as well. So as you see in the academic environment in Rijeka, philosophers are in charge in all positions, and we have a kind of Plato republic now as ambassador. So please,
Thank you, Elvio, dear colleagues. I'm really honored and pleased that I have an opportunity on behalf of the University of Rijeka and the Center for Advanced Studies to say just a few welcoming words to all of you. I would like to begin to congratulate you to your organizational board. My warmest congratulations to Elvio Maccarini and Jose Luis Marti. You really did a great job. You know, this is our first summer school, you know, of the Center for Advanced Studies, and I definitely believe it's not the last. I hope it will be in a successful start of some, you know, tradition. Also, I would like to thank you, other members of the organizational board, especially to Ivan and Andrea, and to all other students and the members of organizational board. Also, I would like to thank to our keynote speakers, you know, distinguished professor from the University of Arizona, Professor ThomasChristiano, also Professor Andrew Williams from Universitat Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona. Thank you very much. And to David Miller, who will, as Elvio actually told us, will join us, you know, on Wednesday. Yeah. So also I would like to thank to all of you students, docs, postdocs, who find out, who recognize this summer school as an opportunity to exchange ideas about very hot topics on democracy, equality, citizenship, and probably I'm just a bit biased, but it seems to me that at this very moment in Croatia, but not only in Croatia, there's no, let us say, the hottest topic than the topic we will discuss here. You know, the situation in which have in our European Parliament, you know, very strong movement, right movement, who actually stress kind of anti-immigration policies. We will discuss here the question of immigration policies, migration, demography. It seems to me that it's really, really very important. Also in the context in which, you know, Financial Times, you know, evaluate Croatia as, let us say, a new Greece, the country, and the political and economic crisis. It seems to me that it's necessary to talk about democracy, global democracy, economic justice, about, you know, the decision-making process, and all other relevant topics. And I'm really glad that the mayor and the representative of our country are here, you know, to share with us, you know, the importance of this topic. Finally, I wish to all of us successful work. I wish to all of us that this summer school will be not only a great professional experience for all of us, but also, you know, the pleasant personal experience. I hope that we will spend a nice time here in Rijeka, at the University of Rijeka. And thank you to all of you once more, and definitely to your organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to invite Mrs. Zubita Stilin, who represents the county of that is our region, administrative unit, and she's in charge of the sector of education, schools, the university as well. Please.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, I'm glad to have the opportunity to greet and welcome such prestigious guests. Thank you for coming. The region of Primorsko-Goranska is very proud to host this event, which has a long and a significant history of science, but also political and historical influence. Such tradition has survived through the lives and work of many renowned experts and scientists who have excelled at the University of Rijeka. That's the reason that we welcome world scientists with own Dear colleague, in the name of the County of Primorje and Gorski Kotar, our Governor, Vlatko Komadina, and myself wish you welcome and proactive work to our summer school. Thank you and enjoy the organization, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now it is my honor and privilege to invite our mayor, Mr. Augustinel, to open the summer school. It is really not a surprise for us to have you with us today, because we know you always support very much culture, education, and science.
Thank you, dear participants and honorable guests, it is my great pleasure to greet you and wish all warm welcome to Rijeka on behalf of the city of Rijeka and of course myself. First of all, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the hosts, Faculty of Humanities and Social Science of the University of Rijeka, and of course Center for Advanced Studies of Southeast Europe for having established this successful cooperation with the universities of Barcelona and Leeds that result in organizing this summer school named Equality and Citizenships, being held in Rijeka for the first time. It gives me great pleasure to welcome experts in the fields of political philosophy coming from University of Arizona, Oxford and Barcelona, who are acknowledged for their work on themes such as equality, democracy, social justice, the relations between national and cultural groups, immigrations and citizens' participations in decision-making process and politics. These are important, actual and interesting topics that interest me greatly, since the mayor job is exactly based on decision-making on daily basis in order to arrange our living surrounding and ways of functioning in society, taking into consideration the previously mentioned principles. Particularly in the process of decision-making, it is very important to take into consideration each society member's opinion, to see what his or her aims and interests are, and then by taking into consideration principles of equality, to make decisions that will enable and positively act on the realization of one's aims in order to achieve citizens' happiness. From my point of view, it is essential for political institutions to give each person an equal right to participate in the process of debate. In the city of Rijeka, for example, we have given our citizens the possibility to participate in e-consultations via our website, where they can say their opinion and explain their point of view for particular topics. But as I can see from the summer school program, there is numerous lecture and discussions in front of you, so I don't want to take your time, but wish you a successful and pleasant stay in Rijeka and work in this summer school, and of course that means that the summer school is open.
Thank you very much. So, the summer school is open, and I invite Professor ThomasChristiano to start his lecture.
Thank you so much for inviting me to discuss some of my ideas with you today. delightful trip already so far. And today what I want to do is discuss a project that I'm working on with you. It's very much looking forward to the discussion because it's a project that is still in a process of evolution. The larger set of issues that I've been working on, of which this is a part, is a question about the legitimacy of international institutions. And so the question being, what's the legitimacy of institutions such as, if any, legitimacy, such as the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, these kinds of institutions, but also institutions such as those of international law more generally, the process of treaty making that creates international law, those international law and international institutions sort of raise this question of legitimacy. Under what circumstances are we obligated to comply with international law and so on. The general framework, which I'm mostly going to presuppose, but we can certainly discuss it in discussion, that I'm going to be that I'm talking within here, is broadly speaking cosmopolitan, which basically sees issues of justice as being issues that are meant to cover people around the world and are not limited to particular political societies. And also from a basically democratic angle. This comes from my previous work on foundations and justification of democracy. And here I'm attempting to extend some of these democratic principles to the process of making of international law. The particular subject that I'm covering today is the issue of migration, which is a very difficult, vexed issue in the modern world. And I'm going to be talking about issues about international treaty making, international law in the context of migration, and when migration is, the big question I think from a cosmopolitan angle is going to be when states are required in various ways to be open to migration, under what circumstances, what are the institutional mechanisms by which this openness ought to be regulated, and so forth. The central puzzle from a cosmopolitan angle and from a democratic angle about migration is a very simple one, which is, if you think about the idea of the traditional idea of the state, and in international law this traditional idea is still quite strong, the state has the right to determine who can enter and who may not enter into the state. There are certain kinds of limits on that right, but nevertheless, it has the right to determine who can enter and who doesn't enter. The central puzzle from a democratic angle is, the determination of who gets to enter or who doesn't get to enter has a very large impact on the interests of those people who are not within the state. Okay? It's a very large impact on those persons' interests. It regulates and it directs their action. It tells them that they have a duty, in essence, not to come in if they're told, if there isn't, migration isn't permitted. From a democratic angle, the question is, how can that be legitimate if those people don't have a say in the making of this policy? I mean, the traditional ideas about democracy are that when a political association directs people's actions, and when it has some significant impact on people's interests, those people have a right to a say in the rules that direct them, that have a large impact on their interests. I'm going to talk more about this and how I think this should be thought through in a minute, but I should make sure I keep track of my time here. What time should I go to, Robert?
So you started at 10:15, you go to 11 or a little bit more.
Okay. So the question is, it looks like they should have some kind of a say, just as citizens have a say in the making of law in their own society. But of course, this goes completely contrary to the way international law itself is structured, at least with regard to migration. Even the most liberal and the most advanced doctrines in international law with regard to migration assign the state a right to determine who gets to come in and who doesn't. And it just says it has the right to determine these criteria. So this is the question that I want to address today, which is how are we supposed to think from a cosmopolitan and a democratic angle about something like migration? There's another issue that I want to flag here because it's going to make a big difference in my discussion, and that is, I think what I'm talking about here first and foremost is a question of legitimacy. And it's not primarily a question of justification. Okay, so I want to distinguish questions of legitimacy from the question of justification. How to distinguish this? The way I think of questions of legitimacy here is going to be questions of legitimacy have to do with the question of who gets to decide on some question. Okay, political societies, international society, and so on are marked by a great deal of disagreement as to what good policies are, what they should be, and so on. And there's a great deal of conflict of interest on these policies, and so on. So you have disagreement and conflict of interest. The question then becomes, well, okay, who gets to decide what the policy is going to be? Okay. This is a traditional democratic question, and it's the question of legitimacy. What's going on here is, I think most of the time when we're thinking about something like migration, we're thinking primarily in terms of, what's the best policy? What's the most just policy? What's the most justified policy? Which policy ought we to have? And most discussions of migration that we see among philosophers, I think, are primarily concerned with justification, with the justice of various policies, and so on. But, obviously what we expect here is that there's a lot of disagreement about what the best policy is. And so then we have this question, okay, so how do we make this decision in the light of this disagreement? And the function of authority, in some sense, is to make decisions that others have reasons to comply with, just because the authority makes them. The function of attributions of legitimacy is primarily to be able to have it the case that these decisions are made in what we might think of as a kind of morally satisfactory way, okay, despite the fact that some of these decisions are unjust, or unjustified, or problematic, which is going to be inevitable from the fact that there's a lot of disagreement. Once you have a lot of disagreement, as long as you've got agents making decisions, people aren't going to be getting everything that they think ought to be. Okay? So that's how we distinguish between justification and legitimate authority. Legitimate authority has to do with the characteristics of a decision maker, in virtue of which others have duties to comply with that decision maker, even when the decision maker makes a mistaken decision. Okay. The other question about authority, which I think is important to talk about in the case of migration, is the question of the limits to authority. Okay. So I think, for example, in democratic theory, it's commonly thought that while certain kinds of decisions ought to be made by democratic assemblies, it's also the case that there are certain kinds of decisions which in some sense are beyond the authority of a democratic assembly. Decisions that, say, violate the most fundamental rights of persons are ones that a democratic authority does not have a democratic assembly doesn't have authority or legitimate authority to make. Okay. And this is going to be an important issue, I think, in the case of migration as well. I mean, so if you're thinking about migration, the first question is going to be, well, who gets to decide when persons get to cross borders? Okay. And the second question that's going to be important is going to be, what are the limits of that decision-making power? Are there certain kinds of decisions that no one is permitted to make with regard to? We'll talk about it. Probably the sort of most standard case of this kind of limit in the case of migration is the case of refugees. Okay, there's a kind of very strong norm that suggests that refugees have to be admitted somewhere into a society so as to protect them from life-threatening or the circumstances that threaten their basic interests. And no process of decision-making that disables people from exiting a society which is threatening their most basic interests can have legitimate authority in that respect. Okay? So those are the issues that I'm going to be primarily focused on, is who gets to decide and what are the limits to that decision-making power. I just want to flag very briefly two sort of very common ways of thinking about migration among philosophers that are important. And we'll hear a lot more about it from one of them, from David Miller, when he comes to talk on Thursday and Friday, and particularly in his talk on Thursday, I think. So one kind of view about migration is that, well, individual political societies have legitimate authority to determine who gets to come in and who doesn't get to come in. Okay, so you have a society like Croatia or the United States, and they have the legitimate authority to determine on their own who gets to come in and who doesn't get to come in. There might be some limits to this, like in the case of refugees and so on. But for the most part, the idea is they have this kind of authority. And the basis of this idea is sometimes thought of, I think most abstractly can be understood in terms of the idea of self-determination, collective self-determination. So societies have a kind of right to determine the characteristics of their own society, and so on. And migration plays a role in influencing the characteristics of the society. The society has a right to determine those characteristics. Now, there are some people who take the rather extreme view that societies have a right to exclude anyone and everybody that may want to come in. Some take a more limited view, like David Miller, for example, has a somewhat more limited and nuanced view of this kind of question. On the other side, the other sort of very contrasting view is a view that has been defended, I think already now 25 years ago, initially by Joseph Cairns, which is that in some sense societies have no right, there's some ambiguity here, but societies have no right to, or they ought not to, prohibit anybody from crossing their borders. Okay. So there's and the initial formulation for Karen's is at least almost entirely the idea that, well, borders ought to be open to anybody who wants to cross them. Okay? Much as a person has a right to go from Rijeka to Zagreb, and then he doesn't have to ask anybody if he has the right to do that. Someone like Karen's is going to argue, well, people ought to be able to go from any other country, like from Serbia or from the United States or from some country in Africa into Croatia as they please. It should be the same norms that affect movement within a country ought to determine the right to move across countries. Okay? So that's the sort of view that defends this idea of open borders that Joseph Karen's, and he's just come out with a book, he's been writing it for 25 years, The Ethics of Immigration. I think it's a good book. It's certainly worth a close read. Now, the one thing about Karen's discussion, and to some degree about the self-determination is it's not very clear on the question of authority versus justification. Karen's actually is quite ambiguous. I mean, you never get it clear whether is he talking about the authority to regulate or is he talking about justification. Because you could think the following. You could take the self-determination view that says a society has the right to determine who should come in, okay, and accept Karen's view and say that, well, it has the right to determine, but of course, if it closes its borders to people, it's not justified. So you could say it has the right to determine who comes in, but what it ought to do is allow anybody to come in. Okay, that's a conceivable position. And the fact that that's a conceivable position suggests that it's not always very clear what the nature of the theses that these people are defending in terms of self-determination and open borders. All right. Now, as I mentioned before, if you look at the self-determination view, there's some people who have criticized this view, and I think pretty effectively. But criticize this view on the grounds that, well, and I mentioned this idea earlier, well, look, if you close your borders to somebody else, you're having a huge impact on the interests of those persons. And you are imposing duties on those persons not to enter into the country. Okay? You're imposing duties on them. And you are having a tremendous impact on their interests. And then the question becomes, well, if you think that, if you follow the democratic principle, which most of these people do adhere to, and you think, well, how can you impose this on these potential migrants without their having some kind of a say in the process by which this border decision is made? Okay. So the democratic principle seems to, once you start thinking in terms of legitimate authority, seems to push beyond the idea of self-determination and seems to force the idea that, well, look, these people want to have a say in whether these borders are open or not. Okay. Now, a lot of people who have invoked this kind of argument have said things to the effect that, well, or seem to be pushing towards the idea that it looks like really you ought to have open borders because, how are you going to organize this process of authority? If you think these people should have a say in whether they should be able to enter or not, how do you give them that say? And then the thought seems to move sort of very quietly to the idea of open borders. What I want to do in this paper is propose a different way of thinking about the question of legitimate authority in this context, and try to work through a kind of framework for thinking about this idea. The basic idea that I want to say is, well, maybe it's not particular states that have the legitimate authority to open or close the borders. But there may still be, for all that matter, something that has legitimate authority. My thought is going to be, well, maybe what we should do is be thinking in terms of international society as having this legitimate authority. Okay? It's not particular states that have the authority, it's international society. Okay? I'm going to have to develop this idea in some detail in order to make sense of it. And maybe in the end it doesn't make sense anyway. But the idea here is to try to formulate a conception of international society and legitimate decision-making in the context of international society that makes sense of the idea that it might actually have legitimate authority over the question of migration. Okay. So let me just say a little bit about this idea. The first thing to note about international society as I'm conceiving of it, and this is part of the larger project that I'm sort of working through. First thing to note is the idea that international society, most of the basic norms, or most of the norms of international society, international law, and so on, are the creation of states. Okay? There's states that created through a process of treaty making. Of course, there is customary international law, but even that is beginning slowly to be more and more replaced by treaty-made norms, and so on. So the idea here with international society is, as I'm conceiving of it at the moment, is to think of it in terms of, okay, when does is the process by which international law is created. Okay. Now the question is going to be, when does that process have authority over the process of migration? Now, the first thing I think to think about when we're thinking about international society is that the traditional doctrine of legitimate international law in international societies is, again, is the doctrine of state consent. And I'm going to hold broadly to that doctrine, namely that states have to consent to international law in order to be bound by it. There are important exceptions to this, but this is still, as it were, the major part of what's going on in international law. But what I want to say is, as we watch international law evolve, and as we watch the development of a kind of international community taking place, it's sort of the evolution of an international community, what we're seeing here is the creation of a distinctive type of political system. Okay? It's a system which is quite different from particular states, and it's also different from the traditional picture of international law, which is that international law is just created by state consent, and it's completely a system of voluntary association. So states can consent to it or not. If they don't consent to it, then they're not bound, and there's nothing further to say about it. So again, the traditional picture is, in some sense, international law as voluntary association, or perhaps as the making of contracts, okay, between states. I think as we see the development of international law now, though, we see a change in how it's going. And there are two contexts which I want to flag. The first context is from environmental law. So in international environmental law, what we see is the development of a doctrine that says something like the following. If one state pollutes, through its productive activity, sends pollution into another society, okay, the doctrine is that state, that society, has a duty to negotiate in good faith with the other society to come up with some mutually agreed upon resolution to this pollution problem. Okay, we see this in a fair amount of international law. In the international law in Europe, you see a lot of cases where, like for example, one state is at the source of a river, and other states are at the tributary of the river, and so the thought is going to be something like, if it starts to pollute that river, then the other states are affected by it. And the thought, what happens is these states then negotiate with each other to try to figure out some mutually agreeable and fair solution to this problem. It's not all one-sided. So that, one way some people have thought about environmental law is, well, if one state is polluting another state, then it just has to stop, and that's the end of it, right? But obviously, this doesn't make much sense if the activity that's producing this pollution is highly productive, right? And then what you might think is, well, what's going on is, well, if you're polluting this other side, then you've got to try to figure out some mutually beneficial way of sharing some of the benefits of the productive activity with the other society, and also sharing some of the costs of limiting the pollution. Here's a case, I think, where you see international law developing in a direction which is different from just merely voluntary association. Because the thought is going to be something like, a state doesn't, it's not really permitted just to say, oh, I don't want to talk to you about that. Too bad for you that you're being polluted. Too bad for you that you're getting acid rain from us. I don't want to discuss it. So the sort of a kind of traditional image of international law, where you've got state sovereignty and so on, that seems like a permissible possibility. But we see in the development now of international law that that's not actually permissible, and that states face very severe criticism and in some cases pressure to negotiate in good faith when they pollute other countries. There's a second aspect of international law that I want to flag here as well. What I want to say is what makes the international system something like a political system is the fact that all the participants, I think, recognize, and I think correctly recognize, that there are certain kinds of aims, certain kinds of goods that are mandatory for all. They all have to try to pursue. Okay. I mean, let's just take a couple of examples of this. We see in the Charter of the United Nations, for example, it's expressed and recognized that all states have a duty to try to participate in creating international peace and security. All states have a duty, this is developing more in international law of late, have a duty to do something to protect people from widespread human rights abuses. Okay. Another piece, I think, of international law, at least, this isn't really international law so much as in declarations. The thought is going to be states declare, like in the Millennium Declaration of the United Nations, I think it was 2006, states declare that they recognize a duty on themselves to try to do something to alleviate severe global poverty. Okay. They just recognize that they have this duty. It's a moral duty that they recognize. There's a kind of mandatoriness to that, to try to solve this problem. And then, of course, in the case now of the protection of the ozone and mitigation of climate change, states recognize and express a recognition of the duty to try to avoid environmental catastrophe for the world as a whole. Okay. So the thought is going to be something like, if we look at the international system as a whole, the thought is there are certain kinds of mandatory aims that every state is supposed to be pursuing. And The thought is that these mandatory aims are to be pursued primarily through cooperation with other states, okay, through treaty making and so on. In some cases multilateral treaty making, in some cases bilateral treaty making. But they have to try to do something to the effect of trying to pursue these basic aims. These aims are mandatory. Okay, so the thought is here that now if you look back at the traditional doctrine of state consent, the thought is, well, it's all optional. Everything's optional. You get to do whatever you want. You know, you don't want to worry about participating in something. You don't do it, and there's no problem. But I think what's going on is in the evolution of international law at the moment, and it is an increasing recognition that in fact there are certain kinds of things which are non-optional. Okay? That all states and all persons, in some sense, ought to pursue in the world as a whole, and they ought to pursue it through cooperation. Okay? Now, I think this still leaves some room for state consent, because the thought still is that even though we might recognize that there is a duty to, say, alleviate severe global poverty, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how to do this. A lot of uncertainty as to how to do this, what the best way of doing it. And there have been lots of things that have been tried and failed. And so there's a lot of question about how to do it. Even in the case of climate change, there's at least a significant amount of question as to exactly the nature of the problem, what a fair distribution of the burdens are, and so on. So there's a significant amount of disagreement there too about how to pursue this. What I want to say is, look, in the international system, what we've got are states. And states are, as it were, by far the most important mechanisms for making power, political power, accountable to persons. Okay, and we do. I think that the democratic states are the ones that try to do this relatively successfully, or moderately successfully, and make power accountable to people. So what we want to do in thinking about international law is make use of this fact that states have this capacity. And there's nothing really else in the international system that can do this, making large-scale power accountable to persons. And so in that respect, the thought's going to be something like, there's room for state consent to the extent that you want a system that's accountable to persons, one. And two, to the extent that there's a fair amount of uncertainty as to how to solve problems, it's important that states be able to refuse entry into certain kinds of agreements if they think genuinely that this agreement is not going to solve the problem that it's meant to solve. Okay. So there's a role for state consent, but it's limited. It's much more limited than the traditional view of voluntary association. And the way to think about it, I think, is to say something like, if states can, in many circumstances, refuse to enter into or even exit treaties that they've made, even with regard to the pursuit of mandatory aims, if they have good reason, or if they have some reason, or some reasonable considerations in favor of the thought that, well, this particular treaty isn't going to solve the problem that it's designed to solve. Okay. So what you have, I think, in the international system is a kind of system of experimentation, states and treaties and regional associations trying different solutions to problems, and so on, at least ideally speaking. But of course the thought is going to be that they're duty-bound to pursue certain aims by means of these treaties, but they can refuse entry. However, they can, that is, refuse entry into the treaty. However, what I want to say is, by virtue of the fact that there are these mandatory aims, states can only refuse entry into an international treaty. And so, if it has some kind of reasonable set of considerations for doing this. So in other words, if there's something within the reasonable disagreement, states say, well, no, I don't think this is the right way to do it, and we're going to try something else in some other context with other states, then I think it's permissible for states not to enter into agreements. However, if they simply refuse to enter into agreements on irrational grounds, they just deny the science on which on which there's consensus, or on unscrupulous grounds, they just don't want to carry their share of the burden, or on self-defeating grounds, we'll talk more about that. The thought is going to be other states have the right, or are permitted, to pressure them into entering into a treaty that they are not entering on the basis of unreasonable grounds. Okay? So this here is the distinctive type of political system, because there is a kind of coercion that's taking place in this system that goes beyond consent. And the reason why there is this coercion is because you've got these mandatory aims that can only be pursued through cooperation. But it's a highly decentralized system at the same time. Namely, it's one where you've got states that are consenting, and so on. And I don't think that there's much choice, but there's not as much optionality for states to enter or exit into treaties. Okay. Now, what is this? So this is sort of the picture now of international society that I have. You can see the society of sort of international society of societies as one on which there are certain kinds of mandatory aims, and on which there are duties to participate in treaty making and so on with other states, okay, which they can be coerced and pressured into pursuing. And I think also this has an effect on the way we should conceive of legitimacy. So, for example, here's the way I want to. We can talk more about this. This is an idea that's still in the process of formation, but the idea is something like, if a society, say, pollutes through acid rain another society, and then refuses to negotiate with that other society on some mutually agreeable terms, then that society is engaged in a kind of illegitimate exercise of power over the other society. It's determining a kind of distribution of benefits and burdens with respect to that other society without giving that other society any kind of say. Okay. And I also want to say that by virtue of the mandatory aims, the idea is that the international system has certain kind of common aims that societies are supposed to be pursuing. If a society, for unscrupulous or self-defeating or irrational reasons, refuses to participate, it's a kind of illegitimate exercise of power over the rest of the system because it's disrupting the pursuit of a common aim without giving the other societies a say in the process. Okay? So this is the way to try to, a partial way to try to extend the idea of democratic legitimacy to international society. So now there's some other dimensions to this, which is that to extend democratic principles, I think, to international society, we've got to be thinking in terms of treaty making in terms of the treaties being the product of fair negotiation among representative states. Okay? Both of these things have come in degrees to some degree. But the idea is a fair negotiation among representative states. It's got to be representative states because the thought from a sort of democratic and cosmopolitan angle is that you want ultimately the making of international law, which is in pursuit of these mandatory aims, to be one that is accountable to the persons who are subjected to it. And the way it's done is by having states negotiate with each other, the way you make that accountable to persons is by the states themselves being representative states. Second of all, the idea is that the process of treaty making has to be fair. That's a very, very hard set of problems to solve, what the nature of fairness in this context is. I mean, I'm not going to talk about it that much in this paper. But the basic idea there, again, is that to the extent that we want persons to participate, broadly speaking, as equals in this process, then the negotiation between these representative states has to be a fair negotiation. Okay. So let's get back to migration. My thought here is going to be something like international society has a kind of legitimate authority with respect to migration. I mean, what this means in the simplest sort of way is just that the way migration should be managed in the international system is through the making of treaties between states, either multilateral treaties, where you've got large scale, like in the case of the European Union, you have a multilateral treaty that regulates migration within the European Union, or a bilateral treaty. Lots of states have bilateral agreements with other states on rules of migration. Usually the bilateral agreements are between states that are sending migrants and states that are receiving migrants. Okay. The thought is going to be, if you think that international societies to have this authority, then the thought is going to be something like the following. States have a duty to negotiate in good faith. It's not they can't just say no. They have a duty to negotiate in good faith about the rules of migration from sending societies into receiving society. It can be in bilateral treaties and so forth. Now, if we think about migration, if we're thinking about it again from the democratic angle, one thing we have to do is figure out what the nature of the interests are among the different parties. What are the interests of the migrants and of the sending societies that are sending these migrants, and what are the interests of the receiving societies that are acquiring migrants. And it's important to think about these interests, I think, because in a democratic theory, what you want to do is ground the right to a say in the fact that these people have important interests. Okay? Now, in the case of migrants, I think I divide, this is actually an interesting difference we will talk about later this week. I divide the case of migrants into three distinct groups where there are different types of interests. There are, on the one hand, refugees, by which I mean, again, a broader notion of refugee, which is a refugee, as I understand it, is a person who is fleeing one country to go to another country in order to, as it were, protect their most basic interests. Their most basic interests are going to be are threatened, either their interests in life, or enslavement, or terrible persecution, or I think also famine. Okay, so you can have also economic refugees in this sense. Refugees, that's one kind of migrant that I think is important to sort of think about here. The second kind of migrant to think about is migrants who move from one country to another because they're improving their position, their economic position. Somebody who wants to become a doctor and from one part of Europe to another, and so on, to get a better paying job, or because they're a more fulfilling job, and so on. That's another kind of migrant. But then there's this intermediate case of migrants, which is very important for the case of Europe and the United States. It's the migrants that are essentially fleeing contexts of pretty severe poverty. It's not life-threatening. They're not fleeing famine, or they're not fleeing necessarily murderous regimes or anything. they're fleeing, they're trying to get away from very serious poverty. And so people, for example, who come from Guatemala or Honduras or Mexico into the United States or Canada, these are people who are living on $3, maybe $4 a day. Their life chances are they're not great. They don't have much possibility for advancement in their own society, and so on. When they come to the United States or Canada, their incomes increase by somewhere between 3-4 times, and sometimes even up to 7 or 8 times the initial income, because even if they're doing exactly the same thing as they did in the other society, what happens is that the particular configuration of production makes them much more productive in either the United States or Canada or in Europe than they were in, say, Guatemala or Honduras or in Africa, North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. I think that this group, this intermediate group, has a special role in reflection here, because I think that it's part of this idea that these societies, all these societies, have duties to try to alleviate severe global poverty. Okay? Now, you might say, well, but is migration really the best way to do this? And that's a good question. What I think we can say is that migration is one of the few reasonably successful ways of alleviating severe poverty. Certainly it alleviates poverty for the person who's migrating. Okay. And second, it plays something, there is at least evidence that it plays through remittances or the return of migrants to their societies, it gives some bump to the development of the societies that send them in ways that we haven't seen so much with a lot of other kinds of anti-poverty programs in the developing world. So migration, to me, it looks like is going to be an important piece, at least for the time being, in trying to solve or trying to do something to alleviate severe global poverty. And so there's a mandatory aim on, say, the United States, Europe, and so on, to negotiate with other societies, in many cases receiving societies, so the United States with Mexico, or with Honduras, or El Salvador, to negotiate terms on which workers can move from one society to another. Okay? That's, I think, they have to do this. They have to do this. So now, but it's important here also, and this is, I think, one of the things that I try to do in this paper, and this is still also in evolution, is to try to figure out what the nature of the interests of the receiving society is in managing migration. Often, when you read something like by Joseph Cairns, it's like all there are migrants. Well, what about the societies into which they go, where they're going into? Those societies, there are people there too, okay? And so they have interests as well. And so the question is going to be, are there legitimate interests that these societies have for having a say in the process of migration from one society to another? Okay? And I think there are legitimate interests. So let me outline the three basic ones that I think of here. And again, these are meant to be legitimate interests from a cosmopolitan standpoint. I'm not invoking the idea of special duties here, or co-nationals, or the idea of self-determination, and so on. The interests, I think, are threefold. The first interest is it has to do with, the basic interest that I want to characterize is in the following way. Each society has a deep interest, and I think the international system has a deep interest in doing this too, in protecting its state's capacity to carry out its core responsibilities. The state has a certain set of core responsibilities to a particular society that each society has a legitimate interest in protecting. Okay? What are these core responsibilities? Well, the way I'm thinking about it, the core responsibilities are the protection, of course, of basic rights and security of citizens. The core responsibilities include the creation of a system of reasonably just distribution within the society. Core responsibilities have to do also, I think, with the protection of the democratic system in that society. And it also, I think, includes the need to create a reasonably stable system of employment and widespread growth within society. These are core responsibilities that states have vis-a-vis the territory that they cover. Okay. Now the question you might ask is why should states be doing this even when it's sometimes to the disadvantage of migrants? Okay. Why should this interest be considered, as it were, as an interest that can be sometimes worked to the disadvantage, possibly, of migrants? We've got a conflict of interest. And here are the three ideas that I have in mind. One is, we have to think, I think, of the international system in terms of the division of labor. Okay. The division of labor in this case is a division of labor that's divided up between, in some sense, sections of the world. So each state, in some sense, protects citizens within its area and tends to realize some modicum of justice and basic rights and security and a reasonably secure system within its borders. Okay. And each state does that for its own citizens. The thought is, there is no other institution who does this in the world aside from states. Okay. All we have are the states that we are members of that are doing this. And this is going to, I think, remain the case for a significant period of time. Now this, I think, is the case even though I think ultimately the borders between states are ultimately arbitrarily drawn. There's no real fundamental reason, I think, for one set of borders or another. Sometimes there are reasons of convenience, administrative convenience, and so on. There's no fundamental reason. And I think in the long run, I think what we want to hope for is a universal, global set of political institutions which brings justice for all human beings. But at the moment, what we've got is a system that is separated out into reasonably, sort of somewhat arbitrarily separated out jurisdictions. And each state takes care of those that are in that jurisdiction. Okay. I think this has to be protected, even though it's the case that some parts of this division of labor don't fulfill that job very well. So there are some states, well, there are failed states, of course, and then there are some states which are not very good states and don't treat their citizens very well. But what I want to say is that doesn't mean that this fact of the division of labor isn't itself an important fact, such that what we have to try to do is make sure that each state is able to take care of its citizens to the extent that it can. A second argument that I want to give is an institutionalist argument. What we have in the modern world is a system of states. And at least many of these states have actually at least moderately succeeded in protecting the basic interests of its citizens, in achieving a certain amount of social justice, in achieving a great deal of growth and prosperity for its citizens. These are, I think, great accomplishments in the history of the world. They are very important accomplishments. And these accomplishments depend on the structure of the institutions that these societies have. Okay. These accomplishments depend on the structures of these institutions. There's another kind of accomplishment which I think is also very important. This I take sort of from my own thinking about democracy. Is a number of states have also sort of at least moderately succeeded in achieving a sense of equal citizenship among its members. Okay. The sense that, well, I'm the equal of my fellow citizens, say in the United States or in a particular country in Europe. And these are generally democratic states that have achieved some sense of equality among citizens. And these are equality among persons who are anonymous, they don't know each other, but there's still a sense of equality. That, I think, also is a great achievement of world historical significance. And the thought here is going to be that the institutions that make that achievement possible are ones that, one, we want to preserve in the absence of other institutions that will transcend them. And two, are going to be ones that are going to have to be served, at least in part, as models for larger cosmopolitan institutions that will slowly come into place, I think, over the next few hundred years, if we're lucky. They have to be models. Institutional structure is a very difficult and delicate process for achieving, decent institutions for economic and social development, as well as for achieving the sense of equality. These are great achievements which we don't want to lose. Furthermore, there's a cosmopolitan argument that I want to make here. Again, for the states being able to carry out their core responsibilities. Okay. And that is that, at least this is the way I'm seeing it in terms of the long-run development of more cosmopolitan institutions. If we look at the development of cosmopolitan institutions, we have to ask, where do they come from? Where do these institutions come from? Okay. Well, basically they come from democratic states. Okay, basically from liberal democratic states that are creating institutions above them that are limiting their sovereignty in various ways. And it's a halting development. It goes, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, and so on. But nevertheless, these are these states that are developing, more and more cosmopolitan institutions. My thought is going to be what we should expect and hope for is that in the long run, these states will develop more and more cosmopolitan institutions, such that eventually what they become are units in some sort of federal system. But I think that it's going to be necessary for these states to successfully carry out their democratic characteristics and the characteristics of social justice in order for them to have this long-run cosmopolitan development. Okay. We can talk more about all these 3 arguments, but those are the 3 arguments where I think that we have to think that there's an important and legitimate interest in each society in being able to protect the basic institutions that are the basis of development and equality. Now, how does migration fit into this? Well, I think the thought is, and a lot of this thought has to be somewhat speculative because we don't really know very much about what happened. We have a lot of empirical evidence about migration, but it's empirical evidence about migration on a fairly small scale. If we're looking at migration into Europe from outside of Europe, if you're looking at migration into the United States from outside, or into Canada from outside, and so on, it's a fairly small trickle compared to what I think would happen if you wanted to open your borders more and more, which I think we ought to. There's going to be, I think that a lot of polls suggest that something like up to 40% of the world's population would like to live in another country. Okay. So right now we're talking about 3% of the world's population living in a country that's different from its date of birth, or somewhere around that. But if you have more and more open borders, you have a much larger population. My thought is that, here's the word. The word is large-scale migration is one in which there is at least a danger associated with having really unwise migration policies. Okay. How does this danger come about? Well, I think one key way in which it comes about is that I think the way societies, reasonably successful societies, have achieved what they have achieved is through the generation of a certain great degree of social trust among the members of the society. Okay. It's a very hard thing to develop. It develops over a long period of time in a lot of these kinds of society. It develops a certain amount of social trust. I think probably very high rates of migration could conceivably prematurely undermine that kind of development of social trust. And it could thereby come to undermine democratic institutions, because I think democratic institutions rely heavily on social trust. Okay. It could thereby undermine a state's core responsibility of redistribution. I think it's a core responsibility, because it depends a lot on social trust. And so the thought is going to be something like there is on the one hand a legitimate interest for states to be able to carry out their core responsibility, and on the other hand, there is the possible danger that very high rates of migration could undermine, at least to some degree, and thus undermine some of these major achievements, and also undermine, I think, the possible development of cosmopolitan institutions in the long run. Okay? We can talk more about all this. So what I want to say is, now we have this idea. I want to say, well, look, it's international society that ought to have this authority. Okay? What that means in this context can be something like negotiation between the United States and Mexico as to some sort of reasonable policy for migration from the United States into Mexico. This was actually something that was a very large development of policy before September 11, 2001 in migration negotiations between the United States and Mexico. They were developing more and more ideas for this. It looked like it was going to actually, they were actually going to get a serious migration treaty between these two states, and then it just stopped because of the obsession with terrorism. I mean, terrorism is a bad thing, but it's become an obsession with these people. So it's just stop thinking about other important problems in many cases, and that's what's happened here, I think. There are bilateral agreements, for example. Here's I think a very really interesting positive case: bilateral agreements between between Canada and Jamaica on migration. These are temporary migration policies. And what goes on is that Canada admits lots of temporary migrants from Jamaica in return for Jamaica making sure that the migrants go back to Jamaica eventually, because they have some information about these people. There's a kind of a mutually agreeable solution for them. So what I want to say is that the United States, Europe, and so on has a duty to negotiate in good faith with other potential sending states on a reasonable level of migration from these other states, in particular to alleviate severe global poverty, okay, or to do something towards that end. Let me just go on over my time. Okay, so let me just say one last thing. There are limits, I think, also to this authority. Again, I think refugee policy represents a kind of limit to the authority here. I don't think international society can be permitted to say, oh, we're not going to allow these refugees to leave. It may not be that a refugee can go into any state it wants to, but it is the case that refugees, there's a duty to make sure that refugees are able to move to a safe and decent place. So that's sort of a picture that I've been sort of developing and working on for thinking about how to extend democratic principles to the international system, broadly speaking, as we see it, namely where states are still the main players, but that it's still democratic and broadly cosmopolitan in such a way that it can give a say to all the different members, migrants as well as non-migrants, because of course migrants get a say in Mexico by virtue of the fact that Mexico is negotiating with the United States. Of course, it has to be a representative state, and obviously all states have weaknesses in who they represent and so on, so there are going to be problems in this regard. But that's the basic picture that I want to develop about the legitimate international institutions about migration. Thank you.